I honor Congressman King.
Thanks, Ellie. Thanks for the introduction and the invitation to be here on the anniversary of that interesting discussion that we had. I think I promised him that night I'll be here tonight, and Ellie held me to that. I'm not sure about that one, though. You know, to start this out on the topic that we have, maybe I just lay out a big picture piece of this, and that is that when you study history, and you live a fair amount of history, which I have by now, you begin to try to put your finger on the currents of history. And I've always asked the question, what's the genesis of this movement or that movement? How did this get started? Who first had the brainchild idea? And then how did it get traction? How did it grow? What gave it that kind of momentum? And if you can understand the genesis of movements, then you can understand how to start your own or end the ones you don't want to see. And so I look at the flow of history this way, that you can talk about economics, you could talk about confrontations, you could talk about the weather, you could talk about technology and inventions. All of this comes back, I think, to culture and leadership. What is reflected from the culture is what we end up with. And the cultures are redirected occasionally by, it has to be especially strong leadership. And so that's been the case as I study American history. It's been the case as I look at European history. And I find out, as much as I think I know about it, there's a lot more to learn because it goes back a lot deeper and it's a lot more complex than our history is here. But as I watched the attacks that came to the United States on September 11, 2001, everybody in this country remembers where they were that day. And of course, I remember where I was, but I hadn't paid very much attention to the force and the pull of the culture and class of civilizations, as one might say, until then. And shortly after that, I was elected to Congress. I went over to Afghanistan, and I went into Iraq. I've made somewhere between 9 and a dozen trips into those war-torn countries. And I remember an early trip in there. I believe it was General Dempsey who commanded the 1st Armored Division in Baghdad at the time, and later on became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He added another 3 stars before that happened. His bookshelf was empty in his office. And a number of other generals were division commanders around Iraq that I visited, and their bookshelves were empty. Second time back through, the shelves were filling up. By the time the 3rd or 4th trip back through, I was seeing dog-eared books in there. And what that tells me is that they were following through on what the Latin term, noce hostum, know thine enemy. And we were not up to speed on that, but America became up to speed, and so did our Western civilization become up to speed and began to understand these forces of culture that were driving the course of history, and who are the leaders that are driving it. And that was a necessary get up to speed task that was in front of us, not only as Americans, but I think the whole free world after that attack, and 3,000 mostly Americans killed on September 11th in those 3 locations. And so as I started to put this together, I wanted to understand, what is this driving force that motivates people to in some cases commit suicide in the effort to kill those people that believe differently than they do? What is that element within their religion, within their civilization, within their culture that brings that about in them? And so I set about going into some of these places to understand it better. So that brought about my multiple trips into Iraq and multiple trips into Afghanistan, visiting with as close as I could get to the local people there. Sometimes security wouldn't allow it to be as close as I would have liked, but I did meet with many of the leaders along the way and got to know some of them personally. And in the course of doing so, I found myself standing on the soil in places where some really bad things happened. And that caused me to pay more attention when the attacks began to unfold across Europe. And so I wanted to just highlight a little bit of what I have seen around Europe, and I thought that the chronology of the terrorist attacks in France was one of the interesting ones that isn't committed to our memory here in this country, but I'm sure it is if you're from there. And I just looked back on this, put this together. In July 25th of 1995, the St. Michael subway bombing killed 8. 1995. There was quite a gap after that. We also had our Twin Towers attack back in the 90s during the similar time, but all the way up till November 2nd of 2011, when there was a Molotov cocktail fire that was started at Charlie Hebdo's. And that didn't end with fatalities, but it was a warning shot, a serious warning shot. Don't disrespect. They had featured a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad, which brought about the Molotov cocktail attack as we understand today. And then in March 19th of 2012, there was another attack, an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and he killed 3 kids, a rabbi and 3 soldiers, 7 dead in that attack. And then in January 7th, 2015, there were the attacks again on Charlie Hebdo, and which brought about 3 days of terror. A policewoman was killed there on the street, as I recall. And then later on that year, in November, there were 130 killed altogether. And these are the locations I remember because I went there. And I went outside Charlie Hebdo's and stood there. It was closed. I couldn't go in. And not very far down the street is where the policewoman was killed. I went to the Bataclan Theater where 130 or so were killed, and over to the stadium where the bombing took place, but none were actually killed, as I recall. And I went to the kosher deli where there were others killed, and I went to the outdoor restaurant where they were shot down sitting in the streets. I believe about 12, if I remember, were killed there. And so I went and stood in those places to try to understand how can one of the most civilized cities in the world have this many terrorist attacks and this many locations. What foments this kind of hatred? Well, it wasn't enough for me to go to those places, but I decided I also need to go down to where these terrorists planned the attacks. And so the State Department wasn't about to facilitate such a trip down into the absolute dead center heart of the most dangerous no-go zone in all of Paris. And so I got a private driver to drive me as close as he would go. And I had one Marine in civilian clothes with me who was detailed to me. He was, of course, unarmed in civilian clothes. And the private driver dropped us off, and he said, down through that alley 2 blocks. And so we got out, and we started down that alley. And believe it or not, the Marine said, I don't think we should go, sir. And, you know, but I think he was worried about me more than himself. And I looked down there and I said, we came this far, we have to go. And so I said, we're going to walk with purpose. We're going to do eyes front. We're not going to be distracted. We're going to go down there to that place and stand in that spot, and we'll decide then what we're going to do. So we walked down through that alley. There was a boxing match going on with some young Muslim men that the fighters were shirtless. They had gloves on. There were about 25 or 30 in a crowd around there. It was like watching a cockfight or a dogfight in another country. We had to walk through that crowd to get there, and we got by with that and got down there to the apartment, was able to at least look up at the apartment, and I was going to do a video from there. I decided this isn't the place to do that. But we turned and we walked out of there another direction and came back around and got out. But I've also gone into some of the other no-go zones in Europe, like the there's a shopping center in Stockholm, the Rinkeby area of Stockholm, and that area has had police officers attacked and beaten up there. And then I've also gone down in through the Molenbeek area in Brussels and walked through the zones there just to get a feel and understanding for this, because this is some of the earliest and the most civilized places in the world. Now, I look at our civilization and I'm watching as people lose confidence in Western civilization. And why would we do that? Why would we lack confidence in our own belief system when, if we look at the accomplishments of our joint civilization on both sides of this Atlantic Ocean, and I would describe Western civilization as Judeo-Christianity, but everywhere where Christianity laid the foundation of civilization. And that includes all of the Western Hemisphere, every square mile of the Western Hemisphere. It includes all of Western Europe, much of Eastern Europe, if not all of Eastern Europe, a big part of the Balkans. It goes east of Moscow, and then it starts to get a little bit undecided when you get down to the Middle East a little ways. I'll say by the time you get to the Bosphorus Straits, you start to wonder which it is. But that gives you an idea of the geography of what I view as Western civilization. And I see that the confidence in our civilization is eroding and it's diminishing. And if we're not strong enough and robust enough to act on the things we believe in, then we'll eventually be subsumed by people who do believe in something different. Nigel Farage was a guest speaker for me about, I guess it was July of 2015. I host a breakfast here in town every Wednesday morning. And he said we must have the courage to define our civilization. And I think that's a big part of this, to restore our confidence in Western civilization. And so one of the images that I use to describe why we not lose faith is if any of you have been to Cologne, Germany, and been to visit the Cathedral of the Dome, it is the most inspiring edifice that I can think of, aside from those things that give me the patriotic feelings in my heart here in this country. But standing outside of there, and I've been there probably 3 times, and gotten the best of tours from the most knowledgeable of tour guides. But when I learned that they laid the cornerstone for the Cathedral of the Dome on the banks of the Rhine in 332 AD and built a cathedral there and went there to worship for a long time, several hundred years altogether, into the Dark Ages. Less than 100 years after that cornerstone was laid, the Visigoths sacked Rome and we went into the Dark Ages. And over those centuries of the Dark Ages, civilization, as we understand it, lost its ability to reason, forgot how to think, lost its history, went into the kind of like the dead zone I have on a cell signal today. Everything went dark, but they still continue to worship in that church. And as they came out of the Dark Ages in 1050 AD, they decided we need to build a bigger and better church. And so the architects at the time drew up a set of drawings. And they drew up their drawings for this most beautiful Gothic church that I have seen. And it's more impressive to me than even the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And so they drew up those plans, and they were raising money all along, and they began to build that church in about 1050 AD. And a couple of hundred years later, they ran out of money. So good, faithful people decided, well, I guess if we can't build anymore, we can continue to raise money. So they continued their fundraising drive for an additional 600 years. For 600 years, they raised money, and they got into the first part of the 19th century, and they decided, we've got enough money now to start up this construction again. Let's finish this Gothic church that we began back in 1050 AD. And so they began working again. But what do you do if it's been 600 years or more since you have looked at your plans or worked off of those plans? They didn't go back and redesign the church. They dusted off the plans from 1050 AD and finished that church. They had the skill sets in 1050 AD to sustain all the way through the Middle Ages, the Age of Enlightenment, into the beginnings of, well, it was well into the Industrial Revolution era. And they finished that Gothic church in about 1888, just in time for the invention of the airplane. And we had a couple world wars. We flew planes over that, but never dropped a bomb on it because we so respected that edifice. But I bring this to you this way, is that if they didn't lose faith from 332 AD until sometime maybe in the 20th or the 21st century even, then why should we lose faith today? Why should we think that our civilization is not strong enough, not confident enough to weather any kind of challenge? Why would we think that this is this hard to hold our resources together, to restore the respect for the rule of law, to build an even better civilization with stronger families, stronger faith, stronger alliance with free enterprise capitalism, and the things that have built Western civilization itself? And so those are the things that I look at that and try to put it in a perspective that way. And then having gone into the no-go zones around Europe, oh, and by the way, I also made a trip during the height of that epic migration of humanity that was pouring into Europe, which still is continuing in different ways. I went into Hungary and over into Serbia and down into Croatia, and I walked in that epic river of humanity that was flowing into Europe and the peak numbers at that time. As I wanted to understand, who are these people, where are they coming from, why are they doing this? And I can listen to somebody else's report, but I asked them. And there were interpreters there along the way, and some people had a few words in English they could speak. I quit asking them where they were from because I realized quickly they weren't telling me the truth. But they were about 80% young males, and they had to be leaving their families to be pouring into Europe the way they were. Here's the standard answer. Oh, they have standard question, standard answer. And it would be, where are you from? Some answer, but not one I believe was truthful. And then, where are you going? Germany. Where in Germany? I don't know. Do you have family there? No. Do you have friends there? No. Do you have a job there? No. How will you live? Germany will take care of me. That's the composite of dozens of interviews that I did there in that river of humanity that was flowing out of Serbia through Croatia into on in through Austria and into Germany. And now Europe is filling up with a population that has not shown demonstrated an ability to assimilate into a host culture. And I recall that there's been a little bit of a different attitude in Europe than there is in the United States, than there has been in the United States, an attitude of, here is my cell of minorities, aren't we multicultural because we can point to these neighborhoods that demonstrate this mixture of multiculturalism. But America was built on assimilation. And the idea was, leave the values. If you've got old grudges from the old country, leave them there. Come here, drop your history if you have to, drop your grudges for sure, recognize yourself first as an American, and let's commingle all of our races that are here and our religions that are here. And I grew up at a time when many of the people that were in my classrooms in school, they didn't know about their heritage. They didn't know if they were German or Italian or Norwegian or whatever it might be. They were just Americans because their parents didn't tell them about their ancestry. They told them, you're Americans. And that has been one of the keys of successful assimilation here. But the process has gone the other direction now. And now it is, first identify with your ethnicity, then your country of origin, and then you get around to becoming an American, maybe a little different than the American next to you. I watched that division come at us now for the last, say, 25, maybe 30 years. And it is starting to divide America in a lot of ways that Europe has been divided as well. And so, and Western civilization is under assault. It's under attack. I did an interview with MSNBC on the opening night of the Republican convention in Cleveland in June of 2016. You remember that? And so we're down to the end of the interview, and a fellow there, and I think his name is Charlie Pierce, and I didn't know who he was before, and he said, one could be an optimist and hope that this is the last Republican convention where old white men, I might have said old white people, but old white people would have anything to say about it. And you cannot let that pass. It was so derogatory. And so I said, Charlie, that's getting a little tired. I'm getting tired of hearing that. I'd like to hear from you. Why don't you tell me what civilization has contributed more? It doesn't mean that every civilization doesn't contribute. They all do. But I take this back. He said, well, how do you define that? Then white people? And I said, no, then Western civilization itself. And then I defined it the way I've defined it for you. Well, you know, it started a firestorm across the country. And it was about a 2-week media cycle beating up on Steve King because what I do? I defended Western civilization. Now, what would the world be without Western civilization? What would we be without the inventions, the technology? We borrowed from everybody's good stuff. I mean, it isn't like we didn't respect flattery is, imitation is the highest form of flattery. So when we borrow different components from the science that came from different cultures and civilizations, when we put free enterprise together, I mean, I can take this back to, I better do it, Mosaic law, Ellie. That's where the rule of law came from. Moses was by the way, he was the first one to download onto a tablet from a cloud. That was Moses. And so he brought us the law, the rule of law, and he set up the structure on how it would be enforced and how it would be judged, and that's written in the book of Judges. And then the Greek philosophers, they had their age of reason too, and they were like, I think Socrates was like the chief gunslinger, and the young philosophers would come and challenge him with their ideas, and Socrates would throw one or more of his 7 questions at them till he shot them down, and they would go back to try again. They laid down the foundation for science. And you get to the Romans, and they gave us a republican form of government. Our founders here rejected Greek democracy. There was a display at the National Archives, years ago at least, that had some of the gourds from the Greek democracies where they would blackball the demagogue and banish him from the city-state for 7 years if his rhetoric was so compelling that they did stupid things on a majority vote. And so our founding fathers looked at that and decided, we don't really want to have this emotional democracy. Let's have the Republican form of government, which much of the history of Rome gave to us, and the rule of law. And Rome spread it across Europe, and they brought their order, they brought their engineering, they brought their design. And there's a lot of our language that's rooted, of course, in the language, in the Latin language, which they gave to us as well. And so Western civilization flows from these things. And not only from these things, but it flows from these things. And then I think of Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations and picked the perfect year to publish it, 1776. What a good time. And that's actually the time that we mark the launch of the Industrial Revolution as well. And so here we are after this long continuum of history, having these tremendous successes behind us, and we have divisions within us that are brought about partly because we don't have enough confidence in who we are, enough confidence to say, you know, we like it when we can recruit people to come into this country that want to embrace our culture and our civilization. But if they want to work the other way, if they want to work against it, if they want to reject our values, they have to make a stronger case than it's different. The case needs to be, how are we going to improve this civilization? We should have an immigration policy in America that's designed to enhance the economic, the social, and the cultural well-being of the United States of America. And every sovereign nation state should have the same motivation. And I watched the model of Hungary, and I've spent some time with Prime Minister Orbán, and I'm quite impressed with the self-confidence he has in the Hungarian civilization. And I went in there into his office one day and sat down to talk with him, and I began to tell him a little bit about the history of Europe. And that was maybe a mistake, because he popped up out of his chair, took me over to show me the mural that goes down this side, the back side, and around that side, which is a mural of the history of Western civilization as regards to Western Europe itself. Quite an interesting thing to see how much that matters to a person like Viktor Orbán. And he says, you want to come to Hungary? We are a Christian nation, and we have our language, we have our culture, we have our history, and if you want to embrace our language, culture, and history, and by the way, religion, then we're interested in you. But if you want to reject it, then we're not interested. That's the right of a nation state. And if we ever think that somehow there's a human right that takes away the decision-making of we the people in the nation state, whether it's the United States or any other nation state, then you're opening your doors up to other values and other motivations. And I am troubled in this country because of the way we've handled it. More than 10 years ago, we had testimony before the Judiciary Committee that calculated, the witnesses testified that our immigration policy in America is based on merit for only between 7 to 11% of all of the legal immigration. And the rest of it is out of our control. It's the visa lottery, it's asylum, it's refugees, it is illegal immigration, by the way, wasn't even part of that equation. And then the family reunification plan. And we get guilted for trying to write legislation that would put the American people in charge of who comes into this country. Right now, our immigration policy is being more controlled by people outside America than it is those inside America. And I'm all for everybody that wants to come here and contribute to our society, our economy, our civilization, but I want them to embrace this American civilization, and rather than reject it when they come here. And there's moral values that go along with it. I said the rule of law. There's an economic responsibility with it. I want to see a wholesome society where families are strong, where our faith is strong, where we have a strong economy. I want to increase the per capita GDP of our people, and we should do that around the world. And one of the things that I believe we need to do is build an international organization to restore Western civilization for the world. And if we can do that and do that effectively, then we've got a core vehicle that will strengthen our confidence in the civilization that I share, and I hope you share with me. And so that's my message here. And it's a complex, it's got a lot of components to it. It's going to take a lot of work to get there, but we have a lot to be proud of. We have a lot to believe in. And we need to act on those things we believe in, and we really need to restore our confidence in our civilization. As Nigel Farage said, we must have the confidence to define our civilization. Thank you very much. Thank you.